Someone erased an entire energy system from history and made sure you would never notice it was gone. Daniel wasn't looking for a conspiracy. He wasn't that kind of person. He was the kind of person who spent his Tuesday afternoons in a basement archive room that smelled like old paper and dry dust, cataloging photographs for a city heritage project that maybe 12 people cared about. He had a cup of cold coffee on the desk next to him, a scanner that jammed every 20 minutes, and absolutely no expectation that anything interesting was going to happen that day. And then he pulled out a photograph. It was a wide shot of a city street taken well over 100 years ago. The buildings were grand, heavy, serious, and every single one of them was covered in metal spires. Not one or two, dozens. They jutted from rooftops like the teeth of something enormous, copper and iron catching the light, sharp against the pale sky. The whole skyline looked alive, bristling, almost aggressive. Daniel sat with that photograph for a long moment and then, almost without thinking, he reached for the folder of images from roughly 30 years later. Same street, same buildings, more or less. But the spires were gone. Every single one. The rooftops were flat and clean and smooth, like someone had taken a blade to them. He told himself it was probably just renovation. Cities change. Architecture goes in and out of fashion. He set the photograph aside and kept scanning. But the image stayed with him, itching at the back of his mind the way a half-remembered word does. So before he locked up that evening, he pulled 3 more folders. 3 different cities. 3 different sets of photographs from the same general period, and the pattern was identical in all of them. Before a certain point, the spires were everywhere. After that point, they were simply gone. Not gradually, not building by building over decades, gone in what looked, from the photographic record, like a single coordinated moment. Daniel stood alone in that archive room with the overhead light buzzing faintly above him, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had spent enough time with historical records to know what gradual change looked like. This wasn't that. This was a decision. Someone had looked at thousands of buildings across dozens of cities and said, "Take them down. All of them. Now." And then someone else had made sure the history books described it as nothing more than a change in taste. He photographed everything with his phone before he left. He locked the archive behind him, walked out into the evening air, and stood on the pavement for a moment looking up at the rooftops around him. Flat, smooth, perfectly ordinary. He thought about the photograph he had held in his hands an hour earlier, all those sharp metal points reaching into the sky, and felt the strange, specific sadness of realizing that something important used to exist in the world and no longer does, and most people never noticed either way. He went home. He could not stop thinking about it. He opened his laptop and started pulling whatever he could find: municipal records, heritage databases, architectural journals. By midnight, he had confirmed the pattern across more cities than he had started with. By 2 in the morning, he had found the first removal orders. And that was when the cold feeling in his chest turned into something sharper. The orders didn't talk about aesthetics. They didn't talk about changing fashions or outdated design. They cited something called unauthorized energy collection, that exact phrase in documents from different cities, written by different officials, filed in different years. Unauthorized energy collection, not structural risk, not wind damage. Energy collection that someone had decided was not permitted. He read the phrase 4 times. Then he closed his laptop, sat in the dark of his apartment, and listened to the quiet of a city that had no idea what had been taken from it. If any of this is making you stop and think, take a second and subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps more than you know, and there is a lot more of this story still to come. The next morning, Daniel called Rachel. They had worked together briefly on a research project a couple of years back, and she was the kind of electrical engineer who got genuinely irritated when numbers didn't behave. He told her what he had found. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Send me what you have." He sent her the consumption records he had pulled overnight from several major public exhibitions of the era. These were large-scale events running for months at a time, drawing enormous crowds, lighting entire fairgrounds after dark with a density and brightness that contemporary accounts described as almost supernatural. He had the daily electrical consumption figures. He also had the documented output capacity of the power plants that had been built specifically to serve each event, and the two numbers did not match. Rachel called him back that evening. He answered on the second ring. She said she had run the figures 3 times because she didn't believe them the first 2. The consumption at these events exceeded what the documented power plants could have generated by a margin that no reasonable efficiency gain could explain. She had looked for records of supplemental fuel deliveries, contracts with outside suppliers, additional generation equipment brought in to cover the gap. Nothing. There was no paper trail for the missing power at all. It was as if a significant portion of the electricity those buildings used had simply materialized from somewhere the official record refused to acknowledge. Daniel pulled up the photographs again while she was talking. All those spires. Hundreds of them, across a single fairground, copper and iron reaching into the sky, connected by frameworks you could see running along rooftops and between structures. He thought about the grounding systems he had found buried in the construction blueprints, shafts driven deep into the earth far below anything structural engineering required. He thought about the phrase, unauthorized energy collection sitting in a municipal removal order like a splinter, and something clicked into place with the quiet, irreversible certainty of a lock turning. The buildings weren't just drawing power, they were producing it. The spires weren't decoration, they were the mechanism. And whoever had decided to take them down had known exactly what they were removing and exactly what would be left once they were gone. The blueprints Daniel found next didn't just challenge the official story, they buried it. After the phone call with Rachel, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the city hummed quietly outside his window. And at some point around 3 in the morning, he gave up trying and went back to his laptop. He had a lead he hadn't followed yet. The consumption gap Rachel confirmed was one piece of the puzzle, but consumption gaps don't explain themselves. Something had to be generating that extra power, and if it wasn't coming from the documented power plants, it had to be coming from the buildings themselves, which meant the answer wasn't in the electrical records, it was in the construction records. He spent the next 2 days in heritage archives, municipal libraries, and one particularly cold storage room in a civic building where original construction documents from the era were kept in flat gray boxes that hadn't been opened in years. The dust was thick enough to taste. His eyes ached from reading faded technical handwriting under inadequate lighting. And then, in the technical annexes of the original construction documents for a grand civic hall built near the end of the 1800s, he found something that made him put the page down very carefully and just breathe for a moment. The building had a grounding system. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was its scale. The specifications described copper cabling running from the roof spires down through the interior walls, through the floors, into a sub-basement, and then continuing downward through a shaft that extended nearly 150 feet below street level. 150 feet. The building's structural foundation sat at roughly 30 feet. Everything below that had nothing to do with holding the building up. The cabling itself, if you added up every documented run listed in the annexes, came to just over 12 miles. 12 miles of copper threading through a single structure like a nervous system. And at the bottom of that shaft, the specs described something called a collection array. It was the arrangement of large copper plates laid out in a deliberate geometric pattern in a chamber carved into the rock beneath the foundation. The official purpose listed in the construction notes was electrical safety and lightning management. Daniel read that explanation and felt a quiet, almost insulted kind of disbelief. 12 miles of copper and a geometric copper array 150 feet underground was not lightning management. That was infrastructure. That was engineering with a specific and intentional purpose that someone had decided to label as something boring so nobody would look twice. He photographed every page. He checked 2 more buildings from the same period before the archive closed. Both had the same features: deep grounding shafts, internal copper networks far beyond any safety requirement, arrays at the bottom. Different buildings, different architects, same fundamental design buried in the technical details where only someone specifically looking for it would ever find it. He walked out into the gray afternoon air with the feeling that he had just read the hidden chapter of a book that had been sitting in plain sight for over a century. He called Rachel from the pavement outside the archive and described what he had found. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's not lightning protection." He said he knew. She said, "That's a collector system." He said he knew that too. And neither of them said anything for a few seconds because there wasn't much left to say. The buildings hadn't been drawing mysterious power from nowhere. They had been built from the ground up to gather it, store it, and distribute it. The spires at the top and the copper arrays at the bottom were 2 ends of the same machine. And someone had gone to enormous trouble to make sure you would look at those buildings and see architecture instead of technology. What Daniel didn't know yet was that someone had already figured all of this out decades earlier, written it down in precise technical detail, and then been made to disappear from the academic record so completely that almost no one remembered his name. His name was Arthur Voss. And the story of what happened to him is where this gets genuinely difficult to sit with. Voss was not a famous man. He was a methodical, careful researcher who worked independently and published through a respected scientific journal in the early part of the last century. He was not chasing a conspiracy, and he was not trying to change the world. He was trying to understand a phenomenon he had observed in his own experimental work. Namely, that tall metal conductors, properly grounded in moist earth, generated a measurable and continuous electrical potential without any fuel source or mechanical input. He built small prototypes. He tested them under different weather conditions, different seasons, different soil types. He documented everything with the patient obsessiveness of someone who genuinely believed that if you measured a thing carefully enough, the truth would eventually sit still long enough to be seen. What he found was that the voltage potential between a deeply grounded conductor and the upper atmosphere was real, consistent, and harvestable. The Earth itself carried a natural electrical charge differential between its surface and the layer of the atmosphere far overhead. A tall metal spire connected to a deep grounding system acted like a bridge between those 2 potentials. Add a capacitor array to smooth the collected charge and a simple converter to bring the voltage to a usable level, and you had a power source that ran continuously, required no fuel, produced no waste, and could be built into any sufficiently large structure almost invisibly. Voss published his findings once. The paper included full schematics, documented measurements, and reproducible methodology. It appeared in print in early spring of one year, and then, as far as the academic record was concerned, it ceased to exist. No citations, no follow-up responses, no rebuttals, which would at least have been something. Just silence, as if the journal's readers had collectively agreed not to notice it. Voss submitted 2 follow-up papers in the years after. Both were rejected without review. The rejection letters said the subject was no longer of interest to the publication's membership. Daniel found a copy of Voss's original paper in a digitized archive of an old scientific journal, buried 11 pages deep in a search result that had no reason to surface it. He read it in one sitting with the specific breathless quality of someone watching a locked door swing open. Because Voss hadn't been theorizing. He had been describing, in precise engineering language, exactly what Daniel had found in those construction blueprints. The deep grounding shafts, the copper arrays, the spires as collection points. Voss hadn't invented anything. He had looked at the buildings around him, understood what they were doing, and written down the explanation. And the year his paper was published was the same year the first removal orders started appearing in municipal records across the country. The removal orders weren't issued by different cities making independent decisions. They were issued by one source, wearing dozens of different faces. Daniel had expected the paper trail to be messy. Historical records usually are. Contradictory dates, missing documents, bureaucratic language that obscures more than it reveals. What he found instead was almost unnervingly clean. The removal orders from city after city were consistent in a way that made his skin prickle. Same phrasing, same justification categories, same procedural steps listed in the same sequence. He had pulled records from enough different municipalities by this point to know that city governments don't naturally produce documents that look this similar to each other. Cities have different clerks, different formatting conventions, different administrative cultures built up over decades. Independent decisions produce independent paperwork. This paperwork looked like it had come from a single template. He started mapping the funding. Every removal project had a stated budget source, and when he followed those sources back through the administrative chain, they kept arriving at the same place. A national body representing the insurance industry, an organization that set building codes and coverage terms across the entire country. On the surface, this made a kind of bureaucratic sense. Insurance companies care about building safety. They fund safety initiatives. That's normal. But Daniel pulled the actual safety data the organization had used to justify the removal campaign, and what he found there stopped him cold in a way that nothing in the archive had managed to do yet. The data showed that buildings with intact spire systems had dramatically lower rates of fire damage than buildings without them. The numbers weren't close. They weren't ambiguous. A properly grounded metal spire system did exactly what basic physics said it would do. It gave electrical charge a safe path to the earth, which meant fires that would have started in unprotected buildings simply didn't start in protected ones. The organization that had funded the removal campaign across dozens of cities had access to this data. It was in their own files. They had looked at evidence that the spires were protecting buildings and then told city governments the spires were dangerous, and the city governments had believed them or had chosen to act as if they did, which amounts to the same thing in practice. Daniel printed the original safety report and the removal justification documents and laid them side by side on his desk. He sat back in his chair and looked at them for a long time. The room was quiet. Outside, a bus went past, and the windows vibrated faintly in their frames. He thought about all those buildings, all those rooftops, all that copper pulled out of the ground and carted away. He thought about Voss's paper sitting unsighted in a digitized archive for over a century. He thought about the phrase, unauthorized energy collection in a municipal permit, and now he understood with a cold and complete clarity what it meant. The energy wasn't unauthorized because it was dangerous. It was unauthorized because nobody had figured out how to put a meter on it yet. The timing of what came next confirmed everything. Daniel cross-referenced the removal completion dates for each city against utility installation records from the same period. In city after city, the pattern was identical. The spire removal was completed. Within 18 months, sometimes less, metered electrical infrastructure was contracted, installed, and activated in the same buildings. The gap between removal and installation was almost surgical in its consistency. It was never long enough to suggest the two events were unrelated and never short enough to prove they had been planned together in advance. Just wide enough to look like coincidence if you only looked at one city. Catastrophically narrow if you looked at all of them at once. Daniel looked at all of them at once. He built a simple timeline on a sheet of paper, city by city, removal date on the left, utility installation date on the right. Then he held it up and looked at it. It looked like a schedule. It looked exactly like a rollout plan for replacing one system with another, executed across an entire country in coordinated phases, dressed up as a series of local safety initiatives so that no single decision-maker would ever have to answer for the whole thing. He thought about what Rachel had said when he first described the consumption gap to her. She had called it a hole in the official story. Standing in his kitchen at midnight with that timeline in his hand, Daniel thought that was too gentle a word for it. This wasn't a hole. This was a door that had been bricked over from the inside, plastered smooth, and then painted to match the wall. And here is the part that genuinely kept him awake at night. He found internal communications from major utility interests dating from the same period. Not leaked documents, not classified files, just trade correspondence that had been sitting in industry archive collections, largely unread for generations. And in those communications, the language was startlingly direct for people who had gone to such lengths to disguise their actions everywhere else. One memo described unmetered energy systems as the single greatest structural threat to sustainable market development in the electrical sector. Another recommended a coordinated approach to regulatory and insurance frameworks specifically designed to make independent generation economically non-viable for the average property owner. The phrase used was not competition. The phrase used was interference. Daniel read that word and felt something shift in his understanding of the whole story. Not anger exactly, something quieter and heavier than anger. Because interference implied that the free flow of energy to anyone who built the right kind of structure was seen not as a business challenge, but as an intrusion, as something getting in the way of something else, as a problem to be managed rather than a technology to be engaged with. Somewhere in a meeting room in a building that no longer exists, people who understood exactly what the spires were and exactly what they did had looked at the prospect of freely available power and decided that the correct response was not to study it, not to build on it, not to make it better. The correct response was to make sure nobody could ever use it without paying someone else for the privilege. Within a few years of those memos, 14 separate regional legislatures had passed laws requiring all electrical generation equipment to be licensed through bodies that were funded by the very utility companies those laws were meant to regulate. The licensing fees were steep. The inspection requirements were designed to be difficult to satisfy. The liability insurance mandates alone were enough to price out any individual or small organization that might have considered building their own collection system. The barriers were not incidental. They were the product. And they worked so completely that within a single generation, the idea of generating your own power from the atmosphere above your head and the earth beneath your feet had gone from a documented engineering reality to something that sounded like a fantasy. But Daniel had the blueprints. He had the consumption records. He had Voss's paper. And he was about to find something far stranger than any of it. Every single person who tried to rebuild this technology in the decades that followed lost everything. Not some of them. Every one of them. Daniel had started his list almost as a side note, a background thread running alongside the main research. He had come across the first name by accident while searching patent archives, a passing reference in a legal filing to an inventor whose atmospheric collection device had been confiscated before his application could be processed. He wrote the name down. Then he found another. Then another. By the time he had been at it for 3 weeks, the list covered 2 full pages of a legal notepad in his increasingly cramped handwriting, and the pattern it described was so consistent and so relentless that he found himself sitting with it in a way that went beyond academic interest. This was something else. This was the feeling you get when you realize the story you thought you were investigating is much larger and much darker than anything you had prepared yourself for. The cases were different in their surface details, but identical in their shape. A researcher named Philip worked independently for years, building a compact collection device based on principles almost identical to those Voss had documented. He demonstrated it publicly on several occasions, powering equipment in front of witnesses who signed written accounts confirming what they had seen. He filed for a patent. Government representatives arrived at his workshop within weeks. They were polite. He later told an associate in a letter that Daniel found in a private archive collection. They were very polite, and they explained that his work posed a regulatory concern and that his equipment needed to be held for evaluation. He was told it would be returned. It was never returned. He was never charged with anything. The patent application vanished from the public record as if it had never been filed. A woman named Margaret developed a scaled-up version of the same basic system and spent 4 years trying to get institutional backing for a proper field test. Every organization she approached declined without explanation. Her workshop was broken into twice. The second time, her primary prototype and all her documentation were taken. The local authorities investigated and found nothing. She rebuilt from memory and notes she had kept off-site. Her rebuilt prototype was destroyed in a fire that investigators ruled accidental. Margaret spent the rest of her working life writing letters to scientific institutions and government bodies that were never answered. Daniel found a folder of carbon copies of those letters in a university archive that had received them as part of a donated collection. Reading them felt uncomfortably like reading correspondence from someone trapped behind glass. A man named Curtis was perhaps the most documented case. He had backing, a small group of private investors who believed in his work, and a workshop equipped well enough to do serious testing. He built a functioning system that ran continuously for 11 days under monitored conditions. His investors witnessed it. An independent engineer witnessed it. Curtis applied for patents on 5 separate component designs. All 5 applications were rejected at the review stage on technical grounds that his independent engineer later described in writing as implausible given the quality of the documentation. 2 years after his last patent rejection, Curtis's workshop was visited by representatives of the Regional Utility Licensing Board, who informed him that operating experimental generation equipment without a license was a violation of recently passed regulations. The licensing fee was roughly 4 times what his entire workshop was worth. He closed down. He never worked in the field again. Daniel read through case after case with the specific tired heaviness of someone watching the same film play out in different costumes. The technology changed slightly with each generation. The response never changed at all. Confiscation without charges, fires ruled accidental, patent applications that evaporated, licensing requirements that appeared with precise timing. No single incident was provably coordinated with any other, but 30-plus cases across multiple decades, all following the same arc from demonstration to destruction, did not produce that shape by chance. Chance is messy. This was neat. This was the neatness of a process that had been refined through repetition until it ran smoothly enough to be nearly invisible. He pinned the list to the wall above his desk. He stood back and looked at it. The names ran down the page in 2 columns, each one a person who had understood something real, built something that worked, and then been quietly and efficiently erased from the field they had tried to contribute to. None of them famous. None of them remembered, all of them gone in the same direction. Rachel called him that evening and he told her about the list. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know what's strange?" He said he was starting to feel like everything about this was strange. She said no, specifically. She had been doing her own digging, and she had found something in the architectural records that she couldn't explain, and she needed him to look at it. He asked her what it was. She said she didn't want to describe it over the phone because she was worried he wouldn't take it seriously without seeing it himself. He told her to send it over. She said she would rather show him in person. Her voice had the careful flatness of someone trying not to sound unsettled and not entirely succeeding. They met the following morning at her office, a room that smelled of printer ink and cold coffee, with architectural drawings rolled out across 2 pushed-together desks and weighted down at the corners with whatever heavy objects had been closest to hand. Rachel had been working on the spire placement geometry, measuring the spatial relationships between spires on multiple major buildings from the era, converting those distances into wavelengths and comparing them against known electromagnetic frequency data. She had done this independently across 8 different structures, spread across different countries, designed by different architects with no documented professional connection to each other. She pointed at the numbers she had written out in a column on a yellow notepad. Daniel looked at them, then he looked at her. She said, "Every single one of them maps onto the same resonant frequencies. Not approximately, exactly. The distances between the spires, when you run the conversion, land on the frequencies at which the Earth's own electromagnetic field resonates most strongly. 8 buildings, different continents, different decades, identical geometric relationships between the spires, as if every architect had been working from the same underlying set of measurements without any of them ever meeting or corresponding." Daniel looked at the drawings spread across the desks. All those spires, precisely spaced, precisely positioned, tuned to the frequency of the planet they were built on. He felt the scale of what he was looking at settle over him like a change in air pressure, because this wasn't just technology, this was knowledge. Specific, detailed, reproducible knowledge about how to make a building resonate with the Earth's own field, knowledge that had apparently been shared across an entire generation of architects and engineers and then vanished so completely that not one of them had ever written down where they learned it. When they demolished the buildings that carried the most advanced spire systems, they didn't just tear them down, they surgically removed the evidence first. Daniel had been sitting with Rachel's geometric findings for 2 days, turning them over in his mind the way you turn over a stone that's heavier than it looks. The shared blueprint, the identical harmonic spacing across buildings on different continents, that was already remarkable enough. But then he started looking at what had happened to the specific buildings where the spire geometry was most precisely documented. The ones where the copper networks were deepest and most elaborate, the ones that, by Rachel's measurements, were most perfectly tuned. And what he found in the demolition records changed the texture of everything he thought he understood about the scale of this operation. Every major demolition contract he examined from the relevant period included a provision that appeared nowhere in standard construction or demolition law. Before any structural work could begin, before a single wall came down or a single floor was cleared, the copper grounding infrastructure had to be fully excavated, cataloged, and removed. Not just disconnected, not just capped off and left in place the way decommissioned utilities normally are. Physically dug out of the earth, every plate, every cable run, every junction point extracted from the ground and accounted for. The contracts specified this with unusual precision, listing minimum excavation depths, required documentation of recovered materials, and mandatory transfer to designated receiving facilities. Daniel pulled the receiving records where they existed. The copper didn't go to standard salvage operations. It went to procurement agents listed only by registration numbers, and from there, it dropped out of any traceable commercial chain entirely. He checked commodity market records from the same periods. The volumes of copper being extracted from these demolition sites were large enough that they should have shown up as market activity. They didn't. The metal was absorbed into channels that left no commercial footprint whatsoever. Tens of thousands of pounds of copper gone. Not recycled, not resold, not reused in any documented way. Just gone. He stood in his apartment at 11 at night with printouts spread across every flat surface he owned and felt the specific dizzying quality of a picture that keeps getting larger no matter how far back you step. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't the natural entropy of old records and incomplete archives. This was active and deliberate removal of physical evidence from buildings that were being demolished anyway, at significant additional cost, under contractual provisions that had no legitimate engineering purpose. Someone had paid extra in time and money and organizational effort to make sure that when those buildings came down, the most technically significant parts of them came down first and went somewhere that couldn't be followed. The question that kept circling in Daniel's mind as he looked at those excavation specs was simple. If the spires were just decorative, if the grounding systems were just standard lightning protection, if the whole thing was as ordinary as the official record insisted, then why did it matter so much where the copper went? Rachel found the answer to a slightly different version of that question entirely by accident 3 days later, while cross-referencing the demolition timelines against property records. She noticed that in several cases, the demolition of buildings with the most extensively documented spire systems had been accelerated beyond the original project schedule. Work that was planned to take months was completed in weeks. She dug into the project management records and found change orders authorizing the acceleration, all citing the same reason. She sent Daniel a photograph of one of the change orders. The reason listed in the official field was expedited removal of atmospheric collection infrastructure, not ornamental metalwork, not decorative spires, atmospheric collection infrastructure. Written plainly in a project management document that had been sitting in a public archive for generations, waiting for someone to look at it with the right question already in mind. The courage it took Rachel to call Daniel and read him that phrase out loud was something he thought about afterward for a long time. Because at that point, they both understood that what they had was not a theory. It was a documented chain of decisions made by real people in real institutions who had known exactly what they were handling and had chosen, consistently and deliberately, to handle it by making it disappear. What they decided to do with that chain of evidence was the hardest part of the whole thing. Daniel published through a small independent research journal, the only outlet that would take the piece without requiring him to soften the conclusions beyond recognition. He and Rachel spent 6 weeks preparing the documentation, cross-referencing every claim against primary sources, removing anything they couldn't directly support with archived material. The final piece was dense and carefully worded and contained no speculation beyond what the documents themselves implied. It went out on a quiet Tuesday morning, and Daniel sat at his desk and watched the notification count climb with the specific anxiety of someone who has thrown a stone into still water and is only now wondering how far the ripples will go. The response divided almost immediately into 2 camps. One camp was fascinated and wanted more. The other insisted the whole thing was misinterpretation, coincidence, gaps in the record filled with assumption. Daniel had expected both reactions. What he hadn't expected was the third category, smaller but consistent, messages from people who said they had found similar patterns in their own local archives and had never known what to make of them. An archivist in one city who had noticed the same removal order language years earlier and assumed it was a clerical standard she didn't recognize. An architectural historian who had documented the geometric spire patterns in a regional study and been told by his institution that the finding wasn't significant enough to publish. A retired engineer who had spent years trying to understand why the grounding systems in several old civic buildings in his area extended so far below any structural requirement and had never found an explanation that satisfied him. They were all looking at the same thing from different angles. None of them had been able to see the whole shape until the pieces were laid out together. Daniel thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. He thought about how the suppression had worked not just through active intervention, through confiscated equipment and rejected patents and demolished buildings, but through fragmentation, by ensuring that no single person ever had access to all the pieces at once. The full picture stayed invisible even when the evidence was sitting in plain sight in public archives. The man who found the geometric patterns didn't know about the consumption records. The woman who noticed the removal order language didn't know about the demolition contracts. The engineer puzzling over deep grounding systems didn't know about Voss's paper. Each piece looked like an anomaly in isolation. Together, they formed something that was very difficult to look at and call a coincidence. The evidence was never fully destroyed. That is the thing Daniel kept coming back to. 100 years of effort to erase this technology from the record, and the record was still there. Incomplete, scattered, buried under layers of misfiling and institutional indifference and deliberate obscurity, but there. The photographs showing the original skylines, the construction blueprints with their impossible copper specifications, Voss's paper in a digitized archive, The demolition contracts with their revealing change orders. The patent records full of devices that were never allowed to reach production. None of it destroyed. All of it made to feel like nothing. And that is the real lesson buried in all of this. The most effective way to hide something is not to destroy it. It is to make the people looking at it feel like what they are seeing does not mean anything. To surround the truth with so much bureaucratic noise, so many official reassurances, so many authoritative voices calling it obsolete or decorative or already explained, that the average person filters it out before it ever has a chance to register. We were not kept from this knowledge by locks and guards. We were kept from it by the quiet, sustained, institutional suggestion that there was nothing worth knowing. The spires were real. The technology was real. The power it could have provided freely to anyone with the structure to collect it was real. And the decision to take all of that away was made not because the technology failed, but because it succeeded in a way that left no room for a bill at the end of the month. So here is the question I want you to sit with. If the people who dismantled this system 100 years ago were alive today, looking at the world they helped build, do you think they would feel like they did something wrong? Or do you think they would look at every metered unit of electricity, every monthly statement, every infrastructure dependency we now take as simply the way things are, and feel like they did exactly what they intended? Write your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story made you look at the skyline differently, even for a moment, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps more people find this, and there is a lot more hidden history where this came from.